Well, I think it makes it a little bit more difficult not having had matches since Barcelona, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so that's a bit of a concern. But he's also, I mean, with his accomplishments and accolades, anytime he takes the court, I think that gets in the heads of all of these guys.
At 23, Carlos Alcaraz has reached the point tennis fans feared was coming far too soon. His comeback has collapsed again. Cincinnati is gone. The US Open is closing fast. And after 4 silent months away from competition, Alcaraz has finally given us enough to understand why this story refuses to die. What he has now revealed is bigger than one withdrawal. It cuts straight into what we all suspected the moment Barcelona became his last match. The wrist was more serious than expected. The comeback kept moving, major events disappeared, yet Alcaraz was not losing because his tennis had fallen apart. He had just completed the career Grand Slam and was 22-3 after Doha. That is what makes this so explosive. A player dominating the sport suddenly started choosing caution over trophies. Then came the statement that changed the mood completely. Alcaraz said he wants a long career and would rather return late than risk his body. Subscribe now for tennis stories with the tension left in. Because this is no longer about one injured wrist. The question now is terrifying. What has Alcaraz already learned about his body that the rest of tennis is only beginning to understand? The answer is not hidden inside some dramatic medical leak. It is sitting in the decisions Alcaraz has made since Barcelona, and those decisions are louder than any rumor. A player who built his reputation on explosive movement, fearless scheduling, and almost reckless confidence has spent months doing the one thing elite competitors hate most. He has stayed away. That matters because athletes at this level do not skip Roland Garros, Wimbledon, and a major US Open warm-up simply because they feel slightly uncomfortable. They do it when the risk of forcing the issue becomes harder to justify than the reward of playing. That is why his latest withdrawal from Cincinnati changed the tone around this story. Cincinnati was supposed to be the bridge back. It was the event that could tell everyone the wrist had settled, the training block had worked, and the defending US Open champion was ready to rebuild match rhythm. Instead, the event disappeared from his schedule. That left Alcaraz without a competitive match since Barcelona and pushed the entire conversation toward New York. Fans were no longer asking whether he could arrive in peak form. They were asking whether he could arrive ready enough to compete at all. There is an important distinction here. Alcaraz has not announced that his career is in danger. His team has not declared that he needs surgery. Nobody credible has confirmed a catastrophic diagnosis. The drama comes from something more grounded. He openly admitted that the wrist problem was more serious than expected, and then he explained that he would rather delay his return than compromise the career he still wants to build. For a 23-year-old who had just completed the career Grand Slam, that is a remarkable shift in emphasis. The man who had been collecting history suddenly started talking about preservation. That word matters because Alcaraz had every incentive to push. He was not dealing with an ordinary stretch of the calendar. Rome offered a major title and valuable ranking points. Roland Garros carried even greater meaning because he was the defending champion. Queens could have restored grass court timing. Wimbledon was one of the biggest trophies on the planet. Cincinnati offered a hard court test before the US Open. Each event gave him a reason to convince himself that good enough was good enough. Yet the repeated decisions went in the opposite direction. The public explanation was consistent. Full wrist recovery became the priority, along with avoiding a problem that might follow him deeper into his career. That is the part many people suspected but could not prove when the first withdrawal happened. Barcelona itself was never the only concern. People worried that the wrist had become serious enough to change the way Alcaraz and his team thought about the season itself. Months later, that suspicion looks far less exaggerated. The context makes it more jarring. Alcaraz entered 2026 with pressure at a level very few players ever experience. Multiple major titles were already on his resume, along with a run to world number 1. His rivalry with Jannik Sinner had also become one of the sport's defining attractions. The only major missing from his collection was the Australian Open, and he fixed that in February by beating Novak Djokovic. In the final, that victory made him the youngest man to complete the career Grand Slam. At 22, he had already collected a milestone that many legends never achieved. He did not slow down after Melbourne. Alcaraz won Doha and extended an excellent start to the year. His season record eventually stood at 22-3 before the wrist problem removed him from competition. That detail destroys one lazy explanation immediately. He was not taking time away because his confidence had vanished. Nothing in his results suggested a player spiraling mentally, and his level had remained elite. The interruption came while he was still operating near the top of the sport. Then Monte Carlo added another layer. Jannik Sinner beat Alcaraz in the final and reclaimed the world #1 ranking. That loss mattered, but it did not signal a collapse. Reaching a Masters final on clay is hardly evidence of a broken game. The bigger consequence came afterward, when Barcelona arrived almost immediately and the wrist gave way during his opening match against Otto Virtanen. Alcaraz managed to finish that contest, but the discomfort changed the direction of his year. At first, he believed the issue might be a smaller problem related to the physical demands of competition. The medical evaluation changed that understanding. He said publicly that the injury was slightly more serious than everyone had expected. That statement is crucial because it marks the point where this story stopped being a routine withdrawal and became something with longer consequences. Once the initial assumption proved wrong, the timetable became uncertain and his priorities changed with it. A few days later, Alcaraz provided the line that now looks like the real reveal. He said he would rather return later and fully recovered because he wanted a long career. That was not dramatic language. It was calm, measured, and unusually revealing. Elite athletes often talk about taking things one match at a time. Alcaraz was talking about years. That difference tells you where his mind had gone. The next tournament had become less important than protecting the larger arc of his career. Madrid came off the schedule. Rome followed. Roland Garros went with it. Missing Paris was especially significant because champions build their seasons around major defenses. Alcaraz had already shown how comfortable he could be on that stage. The prestige, the ranking implications, and the rivalry stakes were enormous. Still, caution won. That decision made it harder to dismiss the problem as a temporary inconvenience. The grass season brought more disappointment. Queens disappeared. Wimbledon followed. At that point, the injury had crossed surfaces, months, and major events. Fans could no longer treat the absence like a short detour. The calendar had moved from spring into summer while Alcaraz remained outside competitive tennis. His name stayed central to the sport, but his actual match count was frozen. That is why Cincinnati carried so much weight. A return there could have changed the entire conversation. Hard courts would have offered a direct test of the wrist under match pressure. Winning a few rounds could have restored confidence. Even a loss might have provided useful information before New York. Instead, Alcaraz withdrew, and the comeback moved again. That is where suspense entered the US Open picture. The entry list still matters. Being entered means Alcaraz had not abandoned the idea of defending his title. It does not guarantee that he will compete. Entry lists are administrative facts, not medical clearances. His status therefore sits in an uncomfortable middle ground. He has not ruled himself out, but he has also lost the tournament that was supposed to provide his competitive preparation. Every day that passes without a match increases the importance of whatever decision comes next. Now bring Sinner back into the story, because the rivalry raises the pressure without explaining the injury. Sinner took the #1 ranking after Monte Carlo. Alcaraz's absence then prevented him from responding on court through the heart of the clay and grass seasons. Ranking battles are built on opportunity. You cannot defend points or collect new ones while injured. The longer Alcaraz stayed away, the more control he surrendered over that race. That does not mean Sinner caused the situation, and it does not mean Alcaraz fears him. Those claims would be cheap. The legitimate tension is competitive. Alcaraz had spent years proving that he could match Sinner physically, tactically, and emotionally across the biggest stages. Now the rivalry had been interrupted by a wrist that would not cooperate. For fans, that absence created frustration, because the sport's most compelling matchup suddenly depended on health rather than form. There's another reason the story feels bigger than one injury. Alcaraz had already been outspoken about the modern tennis calendar. Long before this wrist problem, he warned that the schedule could create physical and mental strain. He talked about how difficult it can be to maintain motivation when mandatory events, majors, travel, practice, exhibitions, and recovery all compete for space. Those comments were debated at the time because critics pointed out that top players also choose lucrative exhibitions and optional events. That debate still matters. It would be irresponsible to say the ATP calendar caused this specific wrist injury because no evidence proves that. A wrist can become injured for many reasons, and the exact mechanism in one case cannot be reduced to a political argument about scheduling. What can be said is that Alcaraz's prolonged absence gives new weight to his earlier concern about how carefully elite players must manage their bodies. Top players live inside a brutal incentive structure. The better they perform, the deeper they go into tournaments. Deep runs mean more matches, fewer recovery days, more media obligations, more travel, and less room for physical reset. Success creates additional workload. That is not a complaint unique to Alcaraz. It is part of the architecture of professional tennis. The challenge is deciding where ambition should stop and preservation should begin. Alcaraz has now answered that question with his behavior. Rushing was available to him, especially with major defenses ahead, but imperfect preparation never became an excuse to gamble. Caution kept winning the decision. That is why the title works when the real story is handled correctly. He has finally revealed what many suspected, not through some explosive confession, but through a pattern that is impossible to ignore. His long-term career now has priority over short-term appearances. That shift is fascinating because his playing identity has always looked built for excess. Alcaraz accelerates violently into corners. Direction changes come with extraordinary force. From there, he can slide, lunge, recover, attack, and turn defensive positions into offense at a pace that makes his matches feel physically chaotic. Fans love that style because it appears fearless. The same style also makes every discussion about durability more emotionally charged. Nobody outside his medical team can responsibly claim that his movement style caused this injury. That would be speculation. The reasonable point is different. A player who attacks the court the way Alcaraz does needs confidence in every part of his body. Wrist trouble can affect far more than comfort. It can influence preparation, racket control, serve mechanics, return timing, and the willingness to strike through the ball under pressure. Even after pain improves, match confidence can take time to rebuild. That is why a comeback is not merely a calendar date. Training without competition is not the same as serving at full pace with a scoreboard running. Practice cannot fully reproduce the tension of a break point. Controlled hitting cannot mimic the instinctive reactions required in a fifth set. When Alcaraz eventually returns, the first question will not be whether he still owns elite shot making. Nobody seriously doubts that. The real question will be whether his body allows him to play freely. Freedom matters for Alcaraz more than for most players because hesitation attacks the foundation of his game. His best tennis comes when he trusts his speed, commits to his forehand, changes direction without fear, and improvises under pressure. If the wrist forces even a fraction of doubt, opponents will notice. Opponents will test the return, stretch rallies, and force him into uncomfortable contact points where the injured area must survive repetition. That possibility is what gives the US Open situation its edge. New York is not a gentle comeback environment. The conditions can be hot, matches can become long, the crowd is loud, expectations around a defending champion are enormous. The draw can punish a player who arrives without rhythm. Even if the wrist is medically ready, Alcaraz could still face the separate challenge of rebuilding competitive sharpness against opponents who have been playing continuously. His 22-3 record proves how high his level was before the stoppage, but it cannot protect him from rust. Tennis punishes hesitation quickly. A few loose service games can change a set. Poor return timing can turn ordinary holds into easy ones for an opponent. Movement that feels half a step slower can expose spaces that were previously covered. Alcaraz has enough talent to overcome imperfect preparation, but talent does not erase the reality of 4 months without tour competition. This is also where fans need to resist the easiest narrative. If Alcaraz returns and loses early, that would not automatically prove the injury has permanently changed him. One tournament after a long absence cannot answer a career question. If he returns and immediately wins, that would not erase the concern either. The important issue is how his body responds over several events, different surfaces, and repeated match loads. His own words suggest that he understands this. Wanting a long career means accepting that one heroic comeback can be less valuable than a careful rebuild. Tennis history is full of players who push through pain because majors feel irreplaceable. That gamble can work, but it can also create a larger problem. Alcaraz is trying to avoid discovering the wrong answer through stubbornness. That approach may frustrate fans who want certainty. It also frustrates the business of tennis because star absences hurt events. Tournament directors want Alcaraz in the draw. Broadcasters want his matches. Sponsors want visibility. Crowds buy tickets expecting the biggest names. None of those interests are illegitimate, but they create pressure around a player whose first responsibility has to be his own health. The tension between personal preservation and tour demands is where this story becomes more than a wrist update. Alcaraz is young enough that people instinctively assume recovery will always come quickly. Youth creates a dangerous illusion of endless physical credit. His recent choices reject that assumption. He is behaving like someone who knows that damage accumulated now can affect seasons later. That is what fans should hear when he says he wants a long career. His focus reaches far beyond surviving another month. Future Australian Opens, Wimbledons, battles with Sinner, and whatever records he still wants to chase all sit inside that calculation. At 23, the horizon is enormous. Risking that horizon for one rush tournament would make little sense if the wrist is not ready. There's also a legacy dimension, completing the career Grand Slam. This young changed the standard around him. Once a player reaches that milestone, ordinary expectations disappear. Every season becomes a conversation about history. People start counting majors. Age curves get compared with Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, and other champions, while projections about future weeks at number one arrive almost automatically. That kind of conversation can make a player feel as if every missed event is a lost piece of destiny. Alcaraz appears to be resisting that trap, at least for now. His decisions suggest that history is not worth chasing if the pursuit compromises the ability to keep playing. That is mature, but it is also unsettling for fans because it confirms the injury was significant enough to change his behavior. Nobody cancels this much of a season without a reason. The most provocative part is that the public still does not know everything about the medical picture. That does not imply a cover-up. Athletes are entitled to privacy, and teams often release only the information necessary for competition updates. The absence of a detailed diagnosis creates uncertainty, though, and uncertainty invites speculation. A responsible reading stays simple. The wrist injury has lasted far longer than initially hoped, and Alcaraz has chosen not to rush his return. That fact alone carries enough drama. There is no need to invent secret surgery or claim doctors have issued some hidden warning. His schedule and his own language already reveal enough. The long gap between Barcelona and Cincinnati supplies the evidence, while the US Open deadline supplies the suspense. If he appears in New York, the first practice sessions will be scrutinized. Fans will watch how freely he swings. Reporters will ask about pain, confidence, and preparation. Every forehand will become evidence in someone's argument. That scrutiny can become unfair very quickly, but it is inevitable because Alcaraz is no longer just another contender. He is one of the faces of the sport. If he does not play, the conversation becomes even louder. Roland Garros and Wimbledon have already disappeared from his year. An absent US Open would turn this injury interruption into the defining storyline of his 2026 season after such a brilliant start. The contrast would be brutal. He began the year by completing the career Grand Slam, then spent much of the season unable to compete. That contrast is why the phrase, "finally reveals," should not be treated as a cheap trick. The reveal is embedded in the change from conquest to caution. Early in the year, Alcaraz looked as if he might take over the entire season. Months later, he is measuring every comeback decision against the possibility of protecting his future. Those two images of the same player could not feel more different. The title also works because what we all suspected is not a medical diagnosis. It is the suspicion that the problem had become larger than a normal short-term setback. Once Madrid went, people wondered. When Roland Garros disappeared, concern grew. Wimbledon made the absence impossible to ignore. Cincinnati turned concern into a genuine US Open question. The pattern built the suspicion before Alcaraz's own long career comments gave it meaning. There is one more piece that makes the situation difficult to judge from outside. Professional tennis does not offer a clean recovery window. A player can rest, train, and feel good in controlled sessions. Yet the real test begins only when competition returns. Match play adds serving under pressure, late reactions, defensive stretches, awkward contact points, and repeated acceleration over several days. Those stresses accumulate in ways practice cannot fully predict. That is why a medical green light and competitive readiness are not always identical. Alcaraz also carries a unique burden because his ceiling has already been established. Nobody is waiting to discover whether he belongs among the elite. He has beaten the best players in the world, won on every major surface, and completed the set of Grand Slam titles. That makes patience harder to sell emotionally. Fans know what he can do, so every missed tournament feels like a stolen chance rather than part of development. The wider scheduling argument adds heat but needs balance. Alcaraz has criticized the demands of the calendar, yet the tour has reasons for maintaining major mandatory events. Those tournaments provide ranking structure, revenue, prize money, and a season fans can follow. Players also make individual choices about exhibitions and optional appearances. The problem cannot honestly be reduced to one villain. What matters here is that Alcaraz had already voiced concern about workload before a significant injury forced him into the longest interruption of this season. His response now gives those older comments a different texture. Those comments no longer sound like frustration after a tiring week. Now they resemble a philosophy he is actually willing to follow when the cost becomes personal. Protecting longevity sounds easy in an interview. Doing it while major trophies, ranking points, and a rivalry with Sinner move forward without you is much harder. That is why New York carries emotional weight even before a ball is struck. Alcaraz would not simply be defending a title. He would be testing whether months of caution bought him the freedom he needs to compete normally. The result alone would not answer everything. How he moves, how he serves, how he reacts after long rallies, and how the wrist responds over consecutive matches would matter far more to the bigger story. A healthy return could make this entire absence look like disciplined career management. Any setback, however, could reopen every concern that has built since Barcelona. Neither outcome is known yet, which is exactly why pretending certainty would weaken the story. The suspense is real because the next stage has not happened, and nobody can manufacture certainty yet. For now, the strongest evidence is the simplest. Alcaraz keeps choosing time over urgency. That choice tells fans more than rumor ever could. His ambition has not vanished, and nothing suggests he has accepted decline. The opposite may be true. He appears determined to protect the version of himself capable of chasing history for years, even if that means sacrificing opportunities that once looked impossible to miss during this season. There is still room for a positive ending. Alcaraz is 23, extraordinarily accomplished, and surrounded by a professional team. Time away can protect him rather than damage him if the recovery is handled correctly. A cautious return is not surrender. It can be the smartest competitive move available. That optimism should not erase the stakes. His rivalry with Sinner is moving fast. Major opportunities do not pause, rankings change, younger players improve. Djokovic remains capable of making history relevant whenever he enters a major. The tour keeps moving whether Alcaraz is present or not. Every month away changes the competitive landscape he will return to. The challenge for Alcaraz is to resist letting that movement rush him. Missing events can feel unbearable when you are built to compete. Watching rivals collect trophies creates pressure. Ranking points disappearing adds another burden. Returning before the wrist is ready would create the only pressure that could truly threaten everything else. That is why his statement about wanting a long career should be taken seriously. This is not a throwaway line. It explains the logic behind decisions that otherwise look shocking. A champion does not skip events because he has lost hunger. Sometimes he skips them because the hunger is large enough to include the next decade. For tennis fans, that changes the way this entire episode should be viewed. The story is not that Alcaraz suddenly became fragile. Instead, even a player who looked almost physically limitless has been forced to respect a limit. That realization is uncomfortable because modern tennis is built around the assumption that its biggest stars will keep showing up. The US Open now becomes the next test of that assumption. Should Alcaraz compete, every round will answer a small part of the question. A withdrawal would make the long-term decision even clearer. Either way, the wrist has already changed the tone around his season. And that brings us back to the question hanging over everything. What has Alcaraz learned about his body that the rest of tennis is only beginning to understand? The answer may be simpler than the rumors. He has learned that winning today can become meaningless if the price is losing tomorrow. His own words point toward caution, while the withdrawals prove he is willing to act on it. At 23, that is the revelation. Carlos Alcaraz has finally shown that his biggest fight right now is not against Sinner, Djokovic, or anyone across the net. It is the fight to make sure the career everyone expects him to have is not damaged by the urge to return one tournament too soon. Whatever announcement comes next will matter, and the first match back will matter even more. Until then, the silence around his comeback will keep feeding the same uncomfortable suspicion. This wrist problem became serious enough to force one of tennis's most fearless champions to change the way he thinks about his future. If you want more tennis stories where the facts stay real but the deeper angle does not get watered down, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments what you think Alcaraz should do next. Should he risk returning for New York if he is not completely match ready? Or should he protect the long career he says he wants and come back only when there is no doubt left?